Hello and welcome. And today I'm going to be talking to Professor Graham Oppy. Graham, you teach at Monash University out in Australia, and is it predominantly philosophy of religion that you're doing? I'm only really aware of your, describing God, arguing about gods, history of Western philosophy of religion kind of books. Do you dip into other areas in your kind of specialization as well?
So I guess I teach mostly, these days I teach mostly philosophy of religion. Probably about half of my teaching is philosophy of religion. I've got two units, one called God, Freedom and Evil and arguments about the existence of God, and one called philosophy of religion, which is a more general thing about religious epistemology, religious pluralism, and usually some stuff about divine attributes. Other things I teach include metaphysics, and epistemology, but I've also taught all kinds of other things like logic and aesthetics and philosophy of mind.
Yeah. So how is it that you sort of ended up getting into philosophy? I understand, did you do your undergraduate in mathematics? I think you...
So I started out doing medicine. I lasted one year, and I kind of realized, because I spent a lot of the time reading philosophy books, so I figured I was probably in the wrong faculty. So then I swapped to doing a double degree so it was science and arts, and I did maths and physics and philosophy and history and philosophy of science. So they were the subjects that I studied in my two degrees.
And what was it about sort of thinking about these questions about God that appealed to you? Were you ever personally kind of involved in religion in any way, or raised in that kind of environment, or was it just you found the ideas interesting?
Okay, so it's sort of an accident that I ended up in philosophy of religion. That wasn't my plan. I'd always been interested in philosophy of religion, but it was a very minor part of my philosophical education. So there was one unit when I was an undergraduate at Melbourne that was taught by Bruce Lentry, philosophy of religion, and that was it until I finished my PhD. Apart from that, I didn't work on philosophy of religion at all. But I mean, to answer the other half of your question, so my parents were Methodists, Australian Methodists, and I grew up going to Sunday school and church. When I was about, it's a bit hard to say, it's 13 or 14, somewhere around then, I just decided that I didn't believe any of it, and I've never kind of been tempted to go back.
But was there a point in time, do you think, in your memory where you would have described yourself as a Christian then? I mean, obviously quite young, but...
Yeah, well, I was definitely raised in a Christian family. So up until that point, until I was 13 or 14, I would have been a Christian.
That's really interesting. Do you ever talk to your parents then, presumably still Christian, about, or do you talk to them about these sort of ideas that you have now?
So my parents have both died. So my mother died quite young. She was in the mid-50s. My father was in his late 60s. My mother retained her religious beliefs right up until when she died. So I remember on the morning of her death, there's this thing that happens just before you die where you kind of get a burst of energy, and she was singing one of her favourite hymns not long before she died. So I think that her faith remained quite strong. My father, on the other hand, really kind of lost his faith to a large extent, at least in the last parts of his life, in the last few years of his life. And he was, I wouldn't say that he became non-religious, but he was definitely kind of looking around and exploring very different kind of worldviews to the Christian worldview that he had up until that point. So in the last weeks of his life, he was reading things about Native American spirituality and things like that. It's hard to say, and we talked a bit, but we didn't talk a lot about that. The things that were happening quite late in his life.
So on this point of sort of worldviews and philosophy of religion, why is it that you think this is such like an important field for people to be interested in? Yeah.
Okay, do I think it's an important field?
Well, yeah, maybe it's just
I mean, obviously, there's a kind of itch there that lots of people want to scratch. So, and by that I mean that people want to talk about their religious beliefs and they want to talk to other people about their religious beliefs. And I think that if you're going to do that, then a good approach is to think about the kind of different worldviews that people can have and what their strong points and weak points are. Some people think that you couldn't live a life without, a worthwhile life without being interested in these topics. I'm not sure that that's right. But maybe we don't want to go in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about it at some point. I know, I mean, me and James Fodor have done a fair amount of stuff talking about some of William Lane Craig's Apologetics, and he obviously focuses quite heavily on the kind of you can't have meaning without God. Life's ultimately you can't have ultimate meaning. But you can still have relevant meaning, and there's not really a distinction there between why the ultimate meaning is so important, I suppose. But yeah, I guess maybe we can talk about some of these things a bit later in the discussion as we. I've got some kind of questions about specific topics, but I guess at quite a high level, I suppose. How should we think about atheism and an atheistic worldview from your point of view?
So one of the important things about atheistic worldviews is that they're very diverse, and they include some worldviews that are religious. There are religions that reject God and gods, and those worldviews are atheistic. If you're characterizing worldviews and kind of dividing them up, the split between the religious and the non-religious is perhaps slightly more fundamental than the one between the theistic and the atheistic. But I think that the divide between kind of the naturalistic and the non-naturalistic is perhaps the kind of best point to start, at least if you're talking to me, because I count myself as a naturalist.
Right.
And so that's the way I want to divide it up. I think of naturalism as entailing atheism. And I also think, though this is more controversial, that it probably entails irreligion as well. So I don't think that you can kind of build a religion on naturalistic foundations, though there are lots of people who disagree, but maybe the disagreement's more about exactly what we're meaning by naturalism than it is some sort of substantive disagreement.
Yeah, I think that question of what is naturalism and how do we define it is quite interesting. I was thinking the other day about trying to write something, and then I was thinking, how can I conceptualize naturalism here in a way that doesn't beg the question against a theistic worldview? Is it because I suppose if God were to exist, then that would be a natural phenomenon. It'd be part of the natural world. So that kind of divide might be arbitrary if God does exist. So am I just saying, well, not, how do you go about meaningfully making that distinction without begging the question against the theist?
So partly you can kind of draw on our intellectual history. So within Christianity, there's a distinction between the natural world and the rest, because God makes everything else, and part of what he makes is the natural world, and then he makes other stuff that doesn't fit into the natural world. So that at least when you're talking to Christians, they've got some conception of what the natural world is that's going to line up very closely with your own conception. They may think that God kind of interacts with the natural world so that there are kind of details about what happens, but the kind of rough idea is that God makes an initial state of the universe and lets the universe run according to certain laws of development. And what the naturalist does is say, okay, that part of the picture is fine, but let's throw everything else away, right? So you're just left with, essentially, with the universe operating, perhaps this is the right way to say it, operating according to natural law or something like that. And that, at least as a first pass, that will do. And there's nothing kind of question begging about this. What you might worry about is the role that the kind of earlier theistic worldview played in that particular way of articulating the naturalistic view. But you can start from the kind of inside and say, so some weird exceptions aside, everyone thinks that there's a universe that's accurately described by physics and chemistry, biology, the human sciences, the natural sciences, the humanities, and so on.
Mm.
I just say that's it. That's all there is. Right? That's causal reality. That's what it is. The other stuff that people want to add to it that's either not required for science or in conflict with science is stuff. Right? And by science here, I mean it very generally, so that it includes. I'm not just thinking about physics. I'm thinking about all of the sciences. Then from the naturalist point of view, you've got no reason to believe in it, or you've got reason to positively disbelieve in it, depending exactly what we're talking about.
So would you say, like the approach that you take, or that someone should take, is sort of to work from almost like our observations of the world and begin to build up a worldview and just see what sort of commitments we need to make to certain objects and kinds of things that exist. And then you're saying, well, I just don't need this extra stuff as an explanation for anything. Is that how you're kind of going about it?
Well, I guess people already have worldviews. So I'm kind of more interested in saying, okay, say what your worldview is, compare it to mine, and now let's see which one does better at the trade-off between keeping things simple and accounting for all of the data that we agree is data, right? So all the naturalistic stuff. And I say the naturalistic worldview turns out to be the best one. It's the simplest because it doesn't have any of the supernatural accretions. And I say there's nothing that the other worldviews explain better. So naturalism comes out ahead. Now, of course, that's controversial, and those are kind of judgments sort of fairly far down the track. But that's my general approach.
In the section on disagreement, opinion, and expertise, you say that we probably shouldn't expect a convergence of expert opinion when it comes to worldviews. And I'm just wondering why you think that is the case. I think one of the questions when I was a theist that was leading me to doubt was why, for example, a Hindu, a Muslim, and a Christian could all agree on what acceleration due to gravity at sea level on Earth is, but couldn't, agree about these questions about gods and souls and so forth. So why is it that you think that it's so difficult to reach like expert consensus on these types of questions?
So the story that I want to tell is something like this. It's just so complicated. There are so many different factors to weigh. If we're just thinking about Christianity, and you think about the kinds of things that apologists will claim are evidence for Christianity, there are thousands of independent things that they're going to refer to. And it's just a difficult, and then on the other side, the kind of simplicity side, I say naturalism is simpler, but you get Christians who'll disagree, who think that somehow or other God's particularly simple, and somehow or other that gives their view an advantage in terms of simplicity. And I think in the end, there's no way of kind of setting all this down in a way that's going to make it transparent to everybody, which is the better worldview. It's going to be a matter for judgment, right? That is, and I think that people can kind of reasonably respond differently to give the different judgment calls on this. So that's why I think that the disagreement can reasonably persist. It's obvious to everyone that the disagreement persists, and there's no signs of it going away. There's no way that we're getting convergence of really even philosophical opinion, never mind religious opinion. That's just the way things are going.
I was thinking, why is it that we see such high levels of disagreement, do you think, on these sorts of topics, like as compared to what I suppose, I mean, like you have disagreement in the sciences on like how maybe interpretations of things, but it doesn't seem to me, and maybe I'm just ignorant, but to be as diverging thought as there is in like philosophy, especially philosophy of religion.
Right. So I think that in science we get an incredible amount of convergence, because and the reason is because gradually we're acquiring scientific knowledge. We're actually getting at the truth. Is probably the, or if you don't want to put it that way, we're getting nearer to the truth. We keep it's kind of not hard to identify which are the best theories that we've got, and there are very large areas. So let's take physics and think about classical mechanics. Right, there's a very big domain where you can just use classical mechanics and it will give you the right answers. Right, that's and if you've got a whole lot of experts doing calculations, they'll all give you the same answers. Now, I assume that this is not some accident and it's not some conspiracy. What it has to do with is that we've got an understanding of how the world actually works. There's nothing like that in religion, according to me.
So,
and that's why you don't expect to see the convergence. Right, you can get artificial convergence. You can kill everybody who disagrees with you. Right? You can make convergence that way, but there's no other way that you're going to make convergence.
So when it comes to the role of debate, reason, and argument, you also have an interesting view, which is different from anything I've really heard anyone else say. But I think it also actually helps to make these kind of discussions a bit more productive. So at the start of the chapter, or the section, I can't remember if it was a section or a chapter, this one, but you said, in Anglo-American philosophy, proofs of the existence of God have long been taken to be the centerpiece of philosophy of religion. Against this long-standing dogma, we argue that alleged proofs of the characteristic claims of worldviews, including religious worldviews, are almost always unsuccessful. And when they are successful, they typically achieve much less than proponents of these alleged proofs might have hoped for. So I'm wondering, first, do you still broadly agree with this? And secondly, could you talk about what this means and where this kind of idea came from in your thought?
Okay, so way back, I wrote a book called Arguing About Gods, in which I said, look, all of the arguments that we've got so far on either side in the debate about the existence of God are unsuccessful. None of them is such as ought to persuade people on the other side to change their minds. And so I've been thinking about this question about the efficacy of arguments and about the inability, it seemed to me, of people to produce persuasive arguments, and thinking about why that might be the case. And eventually I came around to the view that probably it's because people actually don't have a kind of mistaken view about what arguments can achieve. And so I have some quite radical views about that, and about what you should think that it's reasonable to think that arguments can do for you. So suppose that you're disagreeing with somebody, you've got some disagreement of the kind that we're talking about. So we've got a naturalist and a theist arguing with one another. What are the prospects for one of them producing an argument that will make the other one change their mind on the central question at issue? So the naturalist giving the theist a proof that God doesn't exist, or the theist giving the naturalist a proof that naturalism is false, right? So I think the prospects of that are kind of zero, right, at this stage. And then there's a bunch of reasons why I think that the prospects for that are zero, of different kinds. Some of them are sort of a posteriori. right? People have been in this game for a couple of thousand years now. If there was a killer argument out there, philosophers at least would all have converged on the view that the killer argument said was the correct view to converge on, and that hasn't happened, right? I'm picking on philosophers because they kind of care, they know about the arguments and they care about them, and that you would expect them to be pretty good at identifying if an argument was actually an argument that ought to make them, or the vast majority of them, change their minds. So there's those kinds of considerations, but there's also just thinking about what arguments are and what they can do. So suppose I'm going to give you a set of premises and a conclusion, and I'm going to lead you through so that you can see that the conclusion follows from the premises. What might you expect, right, of any argument that you get given? Some of them people will just go wrong. The conclusion won't be supported by the premises, but let's set them to one side. We can think that we're talking about people who are actually kind of reasonably competent at constructing and assessing arguments, so we can ignore that case. What you expect is going to happen if you've got an argument that's got the conclusion. So we'll think about it from a naturalist point of view. I've got an argument with the conclusion that naturalism is true. And it's got a bunch of premises, and there are theists. I'm sort of, before I give them the argument, if they're kind of, let's think of them as philosophical theists, I could bet a huge amount of money that they're just going to reject one or another of the premises in the argument. That's just what you would expect would happen, right? And but one of the things that this reflects is that what happens when you encounter an argument against your view. What you do is you look at it and you think, oh, I don't believe that premise. Phew, right? There's nothing else I need to do. That argument's now got no grip on me, right? So to make a successful argument, what follows from what I just said, I think, is you better start with premises, all of which your opponent accepts, and get out the conclusion that you want. But at least classically, that's just tantamount to saying you've got to find a contradiction in their view. That's what you need to do. Mm-hmm. But even if you do that, suppose you find a contradiction in my view. That doesn't mean I have to accept your conclusion. It just means I have to go back and reconsider. My view is a contradiction. You're telling me I've got a contradiction doesn't tell me what to do in response to it. If I'm a naturalist, I'm just going to move to a slightly different naturalistic view, I would think. That would be the reasonable thing to do. I shouldn't make this earth-shattering kind of, wholesale changes to lots and lots of my beliefs. I should make a little change. So I think the prospects for arguments are just about nil, right? In actually giving people genuine reasons to change their view.
Is this sort of specifically for kind of deductive reasoning, where because it's truth preserving, the premises are going to contain the conclusion? Because I suppose one thought that I have is, let's say if you were wrong and God does exist, how could you find out? How could you be convinced by the other side?
Right. So what you want is something like evidence, right? And if they've got evidence and they give it to you, or things you haven't considered, right? So there might be things your view doesn't explain, but you haven't thought about them. And they say, how do you explain this? And then you think about it. That's what could really make you change your mind. But that's not giving you an argument. It's giving you something else. It's giving you reasons to change your mind. And those reasons it actually isn't helpful to try to dress them up as an argument, right? You have to talk to the person, find out what their view is. That's where you start. And then you have to think, okay, what are they missing that I might give them that would lead them to revise in my direction?
Right.
And the swapping of arguments is just not, especially kind of set piece arguments that have been around forever, is just not calculated to have that effect, according to me. Right. So I think that the whole sort of debate circuit thing with theists and naturalists is pernicious. Right? That's the way to kind of make progress one-on-one is actually to sit down and talk to people and find out what they think, because that's the first step in order to find out if there's anything that you might say to them that might make them change their mind. You have to know what they think first. If you've got no interest in finding out what they think, you really shouldn't be in the business of, trying to make them change their minds.
Mm-hmm. So interestingly, in that section of the book, you've got a little kind of back and forth between a character called Pro and a character called Con, who are arguing in this way. And the dialogue almost exactly kind of followed one of your recent debates that you had, where you were essentially talking about, presumably I'm going to reject one of these premises, and then, is there a neutral set of, are we just going to keep kind of following these premises back through different argument forms for, describing like facts, propositions that are in our worldviews. And I wondered, do you think that highlighting this point is something that improves the dialogue when you're talking to someone who disagrees? Do you think you've got to kind of bring them on the same page about this in order to make progress forward? Like how do you sort of change up the script so as you're not just kind of asserting worldviews at each other? How do you engage in dialogue with people with competing worldviews where you can actually both progress, I suppose, and convince each other?
Right. So I don't think that everybody is going to be susceptible to engaging in this kind of conversation. And if they're not, then it's kind of, at that point, at least from my point of view, we might as well just go our separate ways. But there are quite a lot of people who are sympathetic to this, or seem to be sympathetic to this way of approaching things. Right. And so there are other people that I've talked to over the last couple of years who've picked up, at least to some extent, the approach that I'm trying to push. So one thing that can happen is that you can talk to someone who just insists that your view is inconsistent, right? And then you say, but what are the claims that are inconsistent? And they can't tell you. But nonetheless, they go on insisting that your view is inconsistent. I think the prudent thing to do there is just walk away. Right? There's no point. There's no point continuing that conversation. And likewise, if they just say, no, I'm not going to insist that merely because you don't believe in God, you're irrational, but you don't accept this abstruse metaphysical claim, therefore you're irrational. I'm going to say at that point, really? Okay, time to call it quits. Right? This conversation is not going to go anywhere. Yeah.
So I'm wondering then. Let's assume if say you're talking to someone and they see what you're saying. If you raise this point and they go, okay, let's talk maybe more broadly about the commitments of our worldview. How do you assess a worldview? What are like the kind of virtues that a worldview might have that would prompt someone to adopt it?
Right. So there, I've sort of taken my guide from philosophy of science when in philosophy of science people talk about the virtues of scientific theories. So on the one hand, you want to minimize the commitments of your theory. So postulate fewer entities, postulate fewer undefined terms, postulate fewer basic principles. And one way of thinking about this, sort of very approximately, might be take the two views and axiomatize them, and then kind of weigh what's there in the axiomatizations. But that's fairly crude, but something like that. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, in this sort of area, there's just what can you explain? And science has an advantage because it makes predictions that can be tested, but there aren't really testable predictions that come out of the kind of thing that we're doing here, I think, when it's sort of theism versus naturalism. And if you're, I mean, it can in some cases. So if you've got, say, a young earth creationist theist, they're probably making, if you get them to set out their worldview in enough detail, it's committing them to claims that are falsified by data that we've got.
Right.
But if you're careful, if you're not that sort of theist, but if you're the sort of theist whose view is going to be consistent with physics, however physics plays out, and chemistry and biology and so on, then there won't be a difference in the kind of testable predictions of the two views. And so the only thing that you can look at is whether there's somehow or other in the kind of data that we're trying to explain, the things that don't have explanations in scientific terms, whether there's more that gets left unexplained on one view than on the other. Those are the two main things. People sometimes talk about other virtues, but I think that they get subsumed under these two. So people will sometimes say that you should pick the more elegant or the more beautiful theory, but I think that just gets subsumed under simplicity, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Go
on. I guess I'm just wondering then, a lot of times when I talk to people, they'll kind of say, well, naturalists kind of, like on a naturalist worldview, you can't account for X, where X is, I don't know, consciousness, universals, the existence of the universe, something like that. So what would you say is like the scope of options available to the naturalist to take on these kind of metaphysical?
So my response to that will always be, okay, so you tell me what your explanation is, and then I'll tell you how the naturalist has an equally good explanation. So to take an example, you say the explanation of the existence of the universe is because God exists necessarily and God made it. So our ultimate explanation of why there's stuff is because God exists. And I say, okay, let's cut God out of the picture and suppose that the initial state of the universe is necessary. Now we've got a view that does everything that your view did, but at less cost. Right? Mm. And that's a move that I'm just going to repeat over and over and over. I mean, not necessarily saying everything's necessary, but rather taking the explanation that the other person's got and showing how you can just embed it in the naturalist picture, but at a lower cost because you don't have this kind of supernatural stuff added to it. Right, so that's one kind of strategy which I think is very effective. When I'm talking about these things, I'll sometimes say that I make it seem as though I'm committed to the idea that the universe, that the initial part of the universe is necessary. That's not exactly right. What's true is if you ask me to pick, that's the one I kind of like the most, right? That view. But actually, I think the arguments about whether there's an infinite regress, whether it's brute contingency, whether it's brute necessity, are kind of unresolved. It's just that it helps for definiteness to have a view, and so for that reason and kind of inclination, I'll go with the necessary beginning. But in fact, the argument here is general. Whatever the theist says is the explanation, whether they go with necessary God, contingent God, or infinite regress, the naturalist can do the same. And the naturalist view will be better because it gives you the same explanatory bang, but with less commitments. Right. So that's a general idea. Now, if you think about some things, the approach has got to be slightly different. If you think about consciousness, it depends. There, I'm going to take a stand. I'm a kind of identity theorist. I think that conscious states are just some kinds of environmentally embedded neural states, at least for us, for humans.
Is that like a type identity or token identity? Or
so the way I said it was, it's kind of very close to David Lewis's view. It's neither of those, because what you're doing is allowing that there's a type, human beings, and in that type you have this identity, right? But if you considered a different type, aliens, for example, then there might be something else that their mental states are identical to. So it's stronger than token identity, but it's not a kind of global type identity theory either.
And do you think
that's the kind of view I like? Yeah, go on.
I was just going to say in terms of like so some of these other questions, do you think like naturalists, for example, should be committed to like nominalism, say, or would you say there's other options on the table for people who want to be naturalists, like a kind of Platonism or hylomorphism or?
Yeah, so there are definitely options on the table. My own sympathies lie with the kind of Steve Yablo type nominalism. That's where I'd like to go. I don't know if you can make it work globally. And so as with the question about whether the initial singular, the kind of initial part of the universe, what I sometimes call the singularity is necessary or contingent or there's a regress. I don't really have a settled view, but my preference would be for some kind of nominalism. But sure, you can be a naturalist and a Platonist. Naturalism is a view about the causal order. It's completely, qua naturalism, it's just silent on questions about universals, for example.
I suppose then is from your current view of what naturalism is there like a particular argument that you think is could succeed from the theist point of view? Is there one that you've ever kind of thought that's really interesting? Would it have to be, I mean, because we've talked about why it doesn't necessarily compel you to accept the conclusion, but have you ever kind of found yourself, I don't know, like thinking about the calamism thing and going, if the theist could find this thing that would really, I'd really be forced here to be pushed over the edge, accept a supernatural cause or something like that.
Okay, so you mentioned earlier we didn't pick up on the discussion, the distinction between kind of deductive and inductive arguments, and so maybe here we can pick that up again. Because I have another book, a sort of companion. It's in the same series as the Reinventing Philosophy of Religion, called The Best Argument Against God, and that argument is a kind of non-Bayesian version of Richard Swinburne's master argument. So Swinburne's argument is this kind of cumulative case Bayesian argument where you've got a whole lot of different bits of evidence. You start with the idea that the prior probability of theism is much higher than the prior probability of naturalism, and then you start adding in these bits of evidence. And when you get to the end, your kind of posterior for theism is much higher than the posterior for naturalism. Well, I've kind of doing that, but without the numbers. So instead of talking about priors and posteriors, we start off with naturalism as a simpler view, then we start adding in the bits of evidence and we look at the explanations, and it turns out that that there's nothing that theism explains better than naturalism, so naturalism was ahead and remains ahead once we've considered all of the evidence. Now, if there was a good argument, it would be an argument like that, I think.
Right.
The problem is that there's a bunch of judgments that you're making all the way down the line in these arguments. Either you're making up the priors and or you're making these very complicated judgments about simplicity and about the kind of whether something's explained or not. And so I don't see any prospect for those arguments being sort of able to persuade people, even though I think that that's got to be the best kind of argument that we can come up with, unless, unbeknownst to us so far, there is some awful contradiction in one of the positions that no matter how you formulate the positions, you can't escape it. So I don't rule this out. When Russell and Whitehead were working on Principia Mathematica, it seemed like a reasonable project. But Gödel, I reckon, showed that their project was forlorn. There was this hidden contradiction that they hadn't seen, and it took the greatest logician that there's ever been to identify that there was that problem in their project. So maybe there's some contradiction that we've just got no idea. It's sort of sitting there in one of the positions, or maybe in both of them, right? But I think that's kind of remote, and putting that to one side, I don't see that there's likely to be an argument that's going to really give somebody on one side pause. Are there considerations, right? You know, think now about the kinds of things that are brought to your attention. So the first time that you hear about the fine tuning, you might think, dude, that's kind of interesting. I wonder what I'm going to say about that. But one thing you can do is go out and read around in the literature and see what naturalists have said. And, you know, you can have a look at the Feidelson and Sober paper, which is a kind of good place to start. And then you might start, sorry, is that what I meant? I'm thinking of something else. There's a Sober has a bunch of papers about this. I can't remember, maybe Feidelson didn't contribute on this topic. There's something else. Anyway, and you can see that actually, even if you didn't know what to think, going and having a look, that there's no shortage of naturalistic responses to the fine tuning data. Yeah.
So also, just in that past 2 seconds, your mic did something a bit strange. I don't know. Sounded like you went underwater for a second. I don't know if that has ever happened before. But I'm wondering, do you have thoughts about this type of? So I keep seeing it come up in apologetics for some reason in the past year or so, like Bayesian arguments for the resurrection, Bayesian arguments for God's existence. And do you have thoughts about people using this line of reasoning to try and reach the kind of conclusions they do? Like sometimes I have no idea how people kind of figure out what the base rates are on these things in order to use the arguments that they do. Like if we think about the resurrection, and there's a in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, there's a chapter by the McGrews using this kind of reasoning to try and show that Jesus rose from the dead. But I just have no idea like how people would even come up with those numbers and say like, yeah, here's the prior probability of this, to like shove through with a bunch of evidence. And I don't know, do you have thoughts about people using that to try and prove those sorts of conclusions?
So it's a while since I've read the McGrews paper. I do wonder where you're going to get the numbers from, but there are other problems as well, because it's not. So what is the evidence base here? Yeah, there's a very tiny number of texts that report something. That's the evidence base, and that's what needs to be explained: the existence of those texts and there being these claims in that text. And the likelihood that those texts are accurate reports of something that happened, I don't know, 40 or 50 years prior to their being written down. There's a serious problem about base rates for that too. That needs to be discussed.
Okay, so do you have some time to go through some questions from people in the chat? Yeah. The first question that we got earlier was, idealism seems to be a strong metaphysical position that heavily favors theism. Simplicity aside, wouldn't idealism without interactionism and the hard problem win on X power? Not sure. I think they ran out of type space there. Explanatory power. What potential problems with idealism do you have, and what potential solutions to the hard problem might you propose?
So if it's idealism without theism, then it's just about the worst view, because every bit of your experience is just absurd. Where did it come from? What caused it? Right? You end up with a view that just doesn't compress the data at all, is one way of saying it, right? You've got no explanation. Everything that happens is just this new uncaused thing. So I think that non-theistic idealism is kind of hopeless as a view. It's about as bad as a view gets, because it treats everything as absurd. All of the data is kind of absurd. You don't explain anything. If you go to theistic idealism, then we just shift our attention. We now have a cause, right? For each bit of your experience, God's causing it, right? What's the explanation for it? What you end up with is you have this little kind of model of the universe in God's mind that tells God for each person what experiences to send to them. And now the complexity there of that model can't be less than the complexity of the universe. And so again, there's no compression here. There's no explanatory advance, right? The way that the view is more complicated than just the view that supposes that there's a physical universe, because we've got, as it were, the physical universe in God's mind, but we've got God as well. We've got extra stuff, right? So my response is that idealism, either way, whether it's theistic or non-theistic, is more expensive than naturalism and doesn't explain anything any better.
Do you have a way that you get out of kind of epistemic problems that idealists might raise to sort of trap you in the world of the mental?
So I'm not sure what you're
so like Berkeley master argument type things. You know, there's nothing like an idea but an idea. You know, and you can say I refute it thus and sort of slam the table, right? But that's just
Sure. So I actually don't see that there's a problem there, right? Because it seems to me that the most economical explanation of our experience is the one that supposes that there's an external world. And that by and large our experience tells us, at least our kind of, think about our kind of gross visual experience, that's telling us what the world around us is like. That's the most economical explanation. If you the idea that you're somehow or other you're getting it wrong, or that there isn't a world out there at all, is an absurdly expensive theory by comparison. So I don't think that there's a kind of epistemic peril here for naturalists at all.
Okay, so the next question is, how does Dr. Oppy disentangle confusion when a theist blurs abstract/concrete or imaginary/real concepts in a discussion?
We need examples.
Yeah, I would say we could probably do with an example.
So I know philosophy is really hard, and everybody makes mistakes and gets confused. And sometimes you can be confused for a long time, but eventually you sort it out, or maybe you don't. In any conversation, if you think that the other person is confused, what you have to do is just to kind of ask questions to try to sort out, to disentangle, or to help them disentangle if you think that they're confused. And it could be, all right, I mean, a priori, if I'm thinking that you're confused, you probably think that I'm confused too. And there's no particular reason why it's more likely that it's going to be you than me who's the one who's confused. So we sit down and we try and sort it out, and we try to, I mean, this is what philosophers do, try to get it all clear, or as clear as we can. I don't think that there's any particular reason for thinking that it's always going to be the naturalists or it's always going to be the theists who are confused. There'll be confusion on both sides, often enough.
Yeah, I would have liked an example along with that, because I see terms being thrown around like weapons when it comes to apologetics and counter apologetics. Like I don't know, do you have any thoughts on it? It seems like a lot of people are kind of going around kind of collecting arguments like Pokemon or something, and then they go out and battle with them. You know, like I've got logic now. I've got a
right. So, but that goes back to the things that we were talking earlier about what you can actually do with arguments. And I agree that there are lots of people. I mean, you find this on both sides in the debate, who don't really have enough of a background in logic and argument and reasoning and things like that to be able to make a decent assessment of the arguments that they're putting forwards. But and I think that the kind of standard here, although it's quite a high standard, is to look in the philosophy journals and see what the kind of back and forth moves that are being made there are, and how the people there are understanding the key terms that they're using. That's not to say that there's any more progress being made in the journals than elsewhere, but there are some errors that are avoided by and large in journals that get made elsewhere.
So the next question then is, how does Oppy respond to old school Aristotelians and Platonists? Because it seems like you can rephrase the concepts like pure potency is nothing, etc. Or does that not work? I'm not sure. Maybe you've understood that. Yeah.
So I think I understand this question. It's the kind of question that Thomists will ask in particular. So there's a kind of elaborate metaphysics that we get from, not just from Aristotle, because there's a Platonic contribution to it as well, and that's built into the various classical arguments for the existence of God. So in Aquinas' 5 ways, and in other kinds of related arguments. I just said built in, and it's hard to explain what that means exactly, because an argument's just a set of claims, and it kind of stands or falls on its own. If it doesn't, it just means that you've got a different argument in mind, one with more premises that you haven't yet articulated, and we can't even assess whether you've got a good argument until you articulate it, right, and say what the... So there's a bunch of claims about essence and existence and potency and act and things like that are there in Thomistic metaphysics, and that some people, so Ed Feser's a good example of this, some people want to turn into arguments for they want to use these terms in constructing kind of more explicit arguments for the existence of God. So in his book, 5 Proofs of the Existence of God, he has a bunch of proofs of this sort. I think that those proofs are pretty clearly no more successful than all the other proofs going around, because they have lots of premises that naturalists don't accept, and by naturalist lights shouldn't accept. But we can have a discussion. So I have spent some time recently thinking about the topic of existential inertia, which is one of the topics that comes up in this area, and I don't see any prospects of there being a kind of argument that's going, supposing that you're the kind of naturalist who's prepared to say, okay, yeah, things will just go on existing unless there's something that intervenes to stop them from existing. I don't see any good arguments that are going to knock that down at this stage. So I don't know, maybe that addresses the question.
Yeah, I don't know if, I suppose I got confused in the question because I see Platonism and Aristotelianism having links but being quite distinct. So
but Feser has a kind of Platonic proof, and then he has a kind of Aristotelian proof, and he has a Thomistic proof, and I can't remember what the other proofs are, an Augustinian proof probably, right? And there may be an Anselmian one, I don't know. I've forgotten what some of them are, right? And that's consistent with Plato and Aristotle being very different in lots of ways. You can find kind of avenues to God through both philosophers. Though kind of putting their conceptions of God together is kind of difficult, because Aristotle's conception of God seems very different from Plato's.
Yeah, I suppose that it's interesting from that point of view, because surely if your explanation that you reach as a conclusion is like a different God model to this God model, then it's like, well, what do? I've accepted two different arguments here that prove different conclusions, surely. And then, do we become polytheists or,
Well, you try to identify the two, right? And so I'm from memory, this is what Scotus does in his master argument. He has kind of three proofs of the existence of God that prove different first things, and then he has an argument to stitch them together so that there's just one thing. They're sort of triple first.
So the next question is, do you have any thoughts about presuppositional apologetics?
Not really. It seems, there's almost no discussion in the journals of presuppositionalism, for a good reason, because it seems like it's a game that anybody can play, right? So as a move saying, but whatever you say presupposes my position is true, naturalists could just go around saying that too, with as little or as much justice as theists who want to play that way. You very quickly realise that this is just pointless, right?
Well, what's the context?
As a move, it's hopeless. So,
what's the context within which you invoke that fact? What's the ultimate context?
Sorry, what do you mean? Right.
Well, every fact has to be invoked in an ultimate context. So, what's your ultimate context within which you invoke that fact?
All right. This will be very productive.
Yeah. I wonder, I always find that people are sort of, when I speak to presups of that type, they're sort of using words in a really idiosyncratic way where it becomes really difficult to even figure out what they're asking sometimes, where I'm like, what do you mean by context? Like more facts? Like, do you want me to enumerate like every fact in the world or something? And yeah. Anyway, so does Oppy think core philosophical questions will ever reach the same level of consensus as science/math?
If they do, they won't be philosophy anymore. They'll be something else. They'll be elements of some kind of science. So there are areas where we've made progress and areas where we haven't. So if you think about the old natural philosophy, and then you think about physics, right? There were questions that people had that were philosophical questions that ended up being answered by physics. There are other questions that were part of natural philosophy that we still haven't answered, and it's still not clear whether physics is going to answer them or not. So, I'm thinking about, for example, is the world ultimately discrete or continuous? I don't think that we've answered that question yet. And maybe we won't, but maybe we will. Maybe we'll get an answer from physics somehow. There are other parts of philosophy where we seem to have made very little progress. I'm thinking in particular about normative questions, so questions about ethics, where they seem to be kind of still resolutely philosophical. And it's not clear. So I don't really want to make a prediction one way or the other. I have no idea. But there's some reason for optimism, because philosophy, some things that once were philosophy aren't philosophy anymore. That's kind of all I've got.
Okay. So then the next question is, how would you respond to the evolutionary argument against naturalism? And apparently there's a clicking sound, I think, by the way, coming. I don't know if there's like a fan or something around.
Is it coming? It shouldn't be coming from this end unless...
I was muted, I think, while people were saying it was coming through.
Okay, should I mute myself for a second and just see?
Might help us. We're gonna, I don't know if people can, yeah, the clicking sound, they're saying it's stopped there. I don't know what it could be.
Okay, and if I come back, because I certainly can't hear it. I can't hear the clicking sound.
I can't hear it now, but some people were saying it sounded like a cat was purring earlier as well.
That could be the fan in my laptop.
Okay,
maybe. That's possible. My laptop's not very far away from the screen, and I can't move it further away. I'm afraid. So.
It's all right. Yeah, it's not too bad. I don't think so. It seems to have stopped. So. Yeah, the evolutionary argument against naturalism, how would you respond to that? And maybe you could recap, why would it be, why people might think on naturalism we don't have faculties aimed at forming truth, or why you can't be rational with natural, those sorts of things, if you could.
So it's quite difficult because Plantinga gave a bunch of different formulations of this argument. He never really seemed to settle on one that he was fully satisfied with. His idea was that somehow or other, it's you can't think that it's pretty likely that you're not reliable in your belief forming mechanisms, that there's something sort of self-defeating about thinking that that it's quite likely that your belief-forming mechanisms are producing falsehoods. That's the kind of fundamental thought. And then the idea is, if you accept both naturalism and evolutionary theory, then you're kind of committed to thinking that it's kind of that you're not going to be, that your belief-forming mechanisms are not going to be reliable, and so that position will be self-defeating. Now, I think the first step in this is probably wrong, but it's not absolutely wrong, but it's wrong. So there are clearly domains where our belief, and it's the self-defeat was in accepting this. So you're thinking that you weren't reliable while also forming the beliefs. Now, I think that there are domains where we just do this, and there's nothing self-defeating about it. So think about philosophy, and think about your attitude to your philosophical beliefs, and more importantly, think about your attitude to the belief, the philosophy forming beliefs of everybody. It's obvious that we are not reliable when we form philosophical beliefs, because we disagree about everything in philosophy, right? And then secondly, think about yourself now. Isn't it amazing that you're 100% reliable in philosophy when everybody else does so badly at it, right? That just seems like ridiculous hubris. So it seems like the right view to have about your philosophical beliefs, even though you have them, is that probably most of them are false. And it doesn't seem like there's anything self-defeating in that, right? So I'm not inclined to accept the kind of very first step in Plantinga's argument. There seems to be something that's gone wrong there. And it's something that's going to affect him just as much as it affects me. And if you think about Christianity, Christians disagree about all manner of things, right? And it's his Christian beliefs are going to be subject to exactly the same difficulties as my philosophical beliefs are. And he ought to take the same view, right, that I take. He ought to think that there's no inconsistency here between thinking that you're bound to be unreliable here, but nonetheless, you go and forming your beliefs. That's part of the story. Another part of the story is that it's not that we just outright think that we're kind of reliable or unreliable, even when it comes to very specific things. So think about visual perception. Right? I'm really good in bright sunlight, when I'm relaxed, normal conditions, at identifying kind of medium-sized things like trees and cars and stuff like that. Really accurate, not just 99% accurate, but sort of 1 minus epsilon accurate. But if it's a foggy day and the thing's 100 meters away, am I reliable in thinking that that's a tree? No, I'm part of what goes on when we, as we learn to be perceivers, is that we learn to recognize the circumstances where we're reliable and the ones where we're not. And there's nothing sort of self-defeating about thinking in foggy conditions, I think that's a tree, but, my reliability here is pretty low. And so once you think in a more realistic way about what our actual capacities are and the way that they're tuned so that we have views, we don't just form perceptual beliefs and memory beliefs or whatever, but we also have views that we've developed over time and tested out about when we're reliable and when we're not. Right? Then once you've got that sort of picture in mind, then it's just not an all or nothing question about reliability. It's for these kinds of beliefs in these circumstances, I'm pretty reliable. For those kinds of beliefs in those kinds of circumstances, not very reliable at all. But it's still okay for me to hang on to those beliefs. I don't see what's left of the EAAN after you've started thinking about it in those terms. That's a kind of short response.
So another question, and you've been publicly sort of talking about cosmological arguments recently, and John Buck asks, given the A theory of time, would the necessary initial segment of the universe cease to exist after that moment passed? Would it still be necessary then?
So the way that I'm thinking about necessity is that every possible world starts with that same thing. That's the sense in which it's necessary. Right? If you're thinking of it as some people might as a temporal part, then it exists at the initial moment and at no later times. Right? But that doesn't make it not necessary because every possible world starts with it. So that's just to indicate the sense of necessity that I've got in mind. Now, it might be that rather than thinking of it as the initial thing, you just think of it as the universe, because in every possible world, the universe exists since the initial bit of the universe exists. And then what comes afterwards is just whatever other, I'll call them temporal parts of the universe there are.
Also, we've had a few questions asking you what those trophies are in your background.
Okay, let's see if I move this way. So most of them belong to my sons. So they're football, cricket, gymnastics.
Australian football, right? Or
yes, Australian football. So some of them are mine. There's a few of my cricket trophies in there, but I've just the way that this room was set up before, the desk was over in another corner of the room. Well, it was actually a table because I brought home all my office equipment and set it up, and it looked in a different direction and you couldn't see what was in that particular set of shelves. I've just set up my own home office, put it in a different part of the room, and I've taken all my equipment back to work because we're finally perhaps going to be allowed back on campus in a week or two. And I hadn't thought about what you'd be able to see. Yeah, anyway.
You've got to have
the other thing you can see. The other thing you can see is all the games. Well, not all of them. There's another bookcase next to it with games as well.
Yeah, John Buck's asking as well, what's your favourite tabletop game? So
probably. So we have Terraforming Mars, and we've got all of the expansions for it. It makes a fabulous game. We also we also sort of customize bits of it as well, so that it's really lovely to play with. But yeah, probably Terraforming Mars is my favorite.
So there's just a couple more questions to go through, if that's okay, and then we can wrap it up around there, if you're good for time. Can you please ask Oppy how he addresses the brute facts as self-existing and self-ordering beyond just necessary?
So I don't see what there would be beyond necessary. I mean, if something's necessary, then it holds no matter what. So there's no explaining why things are necessary, according to me, in this sense, the metaphysical necessity. Once you've said that the initial, I'll call it the initial singularity, though that's not meant to be interpreted in the light of physics, the initial thing. Once you've said that it's necessary, you've given all the explanation there is to give. Now, that's a theoretical cost. Every time you say that something's necessary, that's a kind of cost in your theory. But theists are going to say that God exists of necessity in exactly the same sense. And when you ask for an explanation, you're not going to get one, because there isn't anything further to say at that point. Now, there are theists who want to go on and talk about other things, other attributes of God, but they don't derive God's necessity from those other things. So that would be I think that's my answer to the question.
I think this person's sort of feels like, in some way, it's like, I don't know if cop-out's the right word. They're just, for some reason, unsatisfied with, like, saying, it's just a brute fact or something. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, but the important thing to remember here is that we're doing a comparison between two theories. And if you've got the same cop-out, so-called cop-out happening in both theories, then it's just a draw on that point. Right? Yeah. It might be, if you really hate that idea and you'd prefer a kind of brute, contingency, or you'd prefer an infinite regress, that's fine. As I said at the beginning, I'm not committed to the brute necessity. It's just, of the three options, it strikes me as the one that you should prefer the most. But I'm not super invested in that. We can go, if you prefer infinite regress, we could go that way.
And then the last question then is, do you have a particular theory of time which you prefer? It seems like in the Loki debate, Oppy's initial state began to exist in a tensed way.
So again, I'm not super invested in any particular theory of time. I kind of like four-dimensionalism because I suspect that that's what general relativity requires, but the arguments about this are difficult, and I don't claim that I'm fully on top of them, but it seemed to me, when I spent some time reading around in that literature, that there are kind of difficulties in being a presentist if you're going to take general relativity seriously. Okay, so I guess that's the answer. I kind of like the idea that maybe time is local, so there might be a part of the universe that's not temporal, and a kind of a causally initial part, that in order to have time, you need to have a metric, and maybe there's a kind of early bit where there's just not enough structure to get a metric, so you don't have time. But that's not helpful in this present debate. That's a kind of separate kind of metaphysical speculation. But yeah.
And then so someone just saying as well, is there a favorite discussion that you've had that people can check out as well? I suppose that if I make that the last question, some people can follow up.
So I had a bunch of good conversations with various people. I wouldn't say there was one that I've had that was particularly a favorite. I did one with a couple of guys in South Africa. They run the Brain in a Vat which I think is quite good. I've had a couple of conversations with Josh Rasmussen, which I quite enjoyed. I think he's quite good, and we had good conversations. Probably they were with Cameron Bertuzzi's channel.
Yeah, I think the Josh Rasmussen, I've seen one Josh Rasmussen one there at least.
I think I've done a couple with Josh. That I also hope are reasonably accessible. I've done some talks with people, so with William Lane Craig and Ed Feeser, and even the one with Andrew Locke, that perhaps are not as accessible as they might have been. We tended to kind of get too excited about the philosophy, right, and started talking to one another.
Okay, well, I appreciate you giving up some of your time to come and talk to me. I think we'll end the conversation around there. I hope everyone who's watching it has sort of learned something maybe, or discovered something about Graham's views that you maybe want to go and pursue. The book we were discussing, Reinventing Philosophy of Religion, though maybe wait till Christmas when there's a Palgrave sale again, when they were on.
Yeah, I'd advise that.
Yeah. And yeah, I'll end the stream around there. If you've enjoyed it, just leave a comment saying what you thought, like the video, and share it around if you want people to see it. Is there anything you want to say, Graham, before we close out?
Just thanks for inviting me on.
Cool. Okay.